turnover is a kiss of death, and that's what happens.
Time for the Angler Within podcast with Roy Bilby.
Well, I know mine was very busy, but how was your weekend, Roy Bilby?
It was stellar. My wife and I left Thursday to head up to New Hampshire because our son was getting married on Friday, which he did.
Oh, congratulations. That's right. I forgot you guys were on the road.
Thank you. We now have a daughter-in-law we truly love. She's been a part of the family for the last 10 years. They just made it official. And Saturday was the big get-together, the reception they had on their property. My brother-in-law and I were there in the morning with my son getting the tents set up, had a 20 by 20 tent that they used for the caterer and for the music table. And then we set up a 20 by 40 tent for a dozen tables and 50 guests for the reception, all family and really close friends. And it was wonderful. Everything went about as perfect as you could imagine. He was on top of the world. We got to meet the in-laws, and they're all wonderful people. And it was just an amazing time. We love them both. We're so excited and happy for them. And I'll give a shout out to my son, Ryan, and my daughter-in-law, Amanda. We love you guys, and just keep doing what you're doing because you're doing it right. It was awesome. That was our weekend.
Did you guys do the cha-cha slide?
I didn't catch that.
Did you guys do the cha-cha slide?
Oh, no, this was not a dancing reception.
No?
No.
Why?
There was no, this is not. Their property's got a little bit of a side hill to it.
No, I'm talking about after so the reception after the wedding, there was no dancing?
No, the reception was the next day.
Was there
It was a barbecue hoorah is what it was.
So there was no dancing at this event.
It was not that kind of reception, no.
Oh. Interesting. Well, good.
It was hanging out, good music, wonderful food, and just great people. Didn't need to dance.
No cha-cha slide.
Nope.
All right. Well, congratulations.
Tell you what, till you brought it up, it didn't even occur to me, and I didn't miss it. So
you didn't miss it. There wasn't any dancing. Roy doesn't like to dance.
I'm a drummer, man. I lay down the backbeat. Let everybody else dance. I don't do that. I want to talk about a topic today that's incredibly timely because this is going on right now. Just the other day, walk into church in the morning, the first thing guy says to me is, "How come the fish aren't biting?" And I was on the phone with a guy later the same day. He's like, "Hey, how come the fish aren't biting?" And the answer, everybody, is the dreaded fall turnover. Now, if you're listening and you don't know what turnover is, in our area, end of summer, very beginning of fall is when the fall turnover occurs. It's a transition period, but it's a horrible one because it shuts the fish down. And if you don't understand it or know what it is, you've seen the effects of it for sure.
I experienced it a lot. I experienced it firsthand last Sunday. Went down to the West Branch, do a little fly fishing. The water is probably, an average of 18 inches in Hale Eddy, I would imagine, 2 feet running through there. Yeah. You can't see the bottom, and it's just murk and just junk floating, algae and stuff floating through the water as well. Just
that's
gross.
Turnover. At a lot of the lakes, and this occurs, it goes to the size of the body of water. The smaller lakes, ponds, it occurs on them sooner than it does on the bigger lakes. It takes, depending on the volume of water, the more volume of water you have, the longer it takes for this to happen, but it will happen. And on average, it lasts about 2 weeks, but depending on environmental conditions and factors, it can be shorter or hopefully not longer, but that happens too. But in general, on average, it's a 2-week period. And once people recognize it, they just don't, they do other stuff and wait till things settle out again. But The phenomenon known as turnover occurs when last week we had 3 nights that dipped down into the 40s. I mean, I'm running a bass boat in the morning and it's 44 degrees, and that's cold. But when you have that 3 nights in a row, it's enough of a constant factor to chill those surface temperatures so much that the upper layer of water gets cold enough where the water below it is warm enough or warmer enough that just like warm air rises, warm water rises because colder water is denser, just like colder air. And when it gets cold enough on the surface, you have enough sustained cold nights. We've got shorter daylight periods. The days aren't as warm. That surface temperature cools enough and that layer gets heavier. The warm water from the bottom rises and passes through that colder layer. But when that warm water rises, it drags with it a lot of that silt and sediment and decaying matter from the bottom, and it rises with it and it fills the entire water column all the way to the surface. I've been driving past the lakes in my area and they either look brown or olive green, and that is a sure sign of turnover. And we had the conditions for it. Everybody's asking me, how come the fish aren't biting? Turnover shuts them down. It decreases visibility to next to nothing. If you're fortunate enough to catch fish, they have an oily feel to them. It's like there must be a lot of duckweed that's plummeted to the bottom, but then came back up through, and that's getting on the fish. Duckweed has got a very oily feel to it. And sometimes you can smell the water in turnover. It's all that decaying matter that's been decomposing on the bottom being brought up through the water column. And if you look at the water, you can see all these particles all the way down through it. It's like a solid blanket, a film of sediment all the way down as far as you can see. And visibility is incredibly decreased. The water temperature is changing, and fish just shut down. That's what turnover does to fish. It shuts them down. And if you're fortunate, you can grind out 2 or 3. If you can catch 10, you had a fantastic day. But I want to share what happened to me just a few days ago. I went to a place that I typically fish, and it's got smallmouth and largemouth in it, and I was targeting smallmouth. I mean, we're in the end of September, and we're already past the fall equinox. Days are getting shorter and shorter, and it's that time of year when I'll do a few largemouth trips after the turnover because they feed big time, but the smallmouth bite is coming on. And from the end of September into December, I'm just focusing on smallmouth. I'm focusing on the brownfish, and man, they gang up incredibly. Turnover is a kiss of death, and that's what happens. But I had a day, I mean, I unlocked the door. I knocked it out of the park. Totally unexpected, because when I pulled up to the lake and I saw how olive green it was, I went, oh man, you got to be kidding me. I had fished it 10 days prior and things were fine. I went to this lake thinking it's not going to be turning over yet like the other lakes. It was full blown turnover. And I had a 6.5 hour block. I came to fish. I went, well, I always pride myself in being able to catch them no matter how negative the conditions are. And I know I'm going to have to work for them. Let's just do this. When I launched my boat, right at the launch, the water was clear right against the edge, but you got out just a few feet and you couldn't see anything. And what I determined, visibility was about 18, 20 inches. I took, my test is always a black jig, and I'll lower it beside the boat. And when I lose sight of it, I lower it with my rod tip to the water, and I just feed line down until I lose sight of that jig. And then I lift it up and I measure the line from my rod tip down to the jig. And 18, 20 inches, I could not see a black jig head. So that was the visibility, tremendously diminished. And I said, well, let's see what we can do with this. When conditions are like that, I generally don't throw baits, moving baits. I don't throw crankbaits, chatterbaits, spinnerbaits. A top water may work, but I don't generally think they're looking up in that condition because the turnover generally shuts them down. but sooner or later they've got to feed. So I generally go with a jig, something I can put down on the bottom. When visibility is diminished, fish get near objects. Same thing with muddy water and high water. When you have a lot of rain, fish will get real shallow because they can relate to stuff along the shoreline. They'll get along dock posts, ladders off of docks, any boat slips, retaining walls, anything that they can relate to and get against in that really, really off color water. It gives them a sense of security. So I'm assuming a turnover, these fish are going to be on the bottom where they can relate to something. So I'm going with basically mostly all jigs. I did have a drop shot. I had a Ned rig. I had a tube. I had grubs. Again, these are my go-tos for smallmouth. And that's what I had rigged. Just after the launch, there's some camps on both sides of the lake. And generally on this lake, what I do is I call it the first camp because it's the first camp beyond the launch. And they have a stone retaining wall in front of their camp. And that wall usually holds a lot of fish under normal conditions. And I'm fishing along that wall and I'm getting absolutely no response. 10 days prior, when I was on the same lake, I had a decent day. I think I caught like 30 some fish, and I think I caught 4 or 5 off that stone retaining wall right out the gate. First cast, they were biting. And I mean, that's typical for that lake. But on this day, full blown turnover, drawing a blank. And I spent about 10, 15 minutes going up that stone retaining wall with my best baits. I mean, the best deal there is typically a tube, a grub, or an Ed rig. And I threw them all. And I'm getting no response whatsoever. But I get to the end of this stone wall where they have a metal dock in the water, and I throw into the corner of that metal dock. I mean, I basically kissed that stone wall, thought I was going to get snagged. I threw too shallow. And before I could pull back, I get a hard strike and I swing and I catch a bass. I'm like, well, okay. I finally got one off this wall. I thought I threw too shallow, but I said, well, maybe that fish is trying to tell me something. So I threw back along the wall where I'd already covered, throwing shallow, and I'm still not getting any response. And that's incredibly unusual because that wall always has 2 or 3 fish on it at a minimum, sometimes half a dozen. It's just a feature that really, really holds fish. I come past that dock and there's a little rock pile that's it's like on top of a point, and it's real skinny around this rock pile. So you got to be careful you don't get snagged. But I said, let me just try in there. I'm throwing my grub and they're not biting it. I'm throwing it real shallow, being careful they're not biting it. So I pick up the Ned rig and I threw it, and I mean dirt shallow, and I got 3 fish and 3 casts, which really surprised me in turnover. Good grief. I've already exceeded my expectations for this day. And I'm only, 25 minutes into this trip. I got another 6 hours to exploit what these fish are showing me. And the funny thing about it was that just past this rock pile, there's a couple little thumb coves, I call them. They're just real narrow, shallow pockets, not very deep, and they're just little indentations in the bank. And I threw in those where the grass overhangs, and there's a few rocks, natural rocks along the bank, thinking I'm throwing way too shallow. But if I hit in that 6, 8 inches of water with that Ned rig, they were on it before I could do my first lift, and they were punching it hard. Now, typically when fish strike really, really hard, that generally tells me there's one of 2 things. There's other fish in the area and they want to hit it before somebody else does. So they're real aggressive on the take, or visibility is so diminished when they see something, they slam it before it's out of their sight. And I assumed it was the second reason, but I caught so many fish in that those two shallow pockets there. Uh, and they're never that busy, but they were just stacked with fish. And I caught so many in those two little pockets side by side. I believe it was for both reasons that the visibility was diminished and there were a lot for whatever reason, there were a lot of fish in those two shallow depressions. And when I pulled out of there, I was on that spot for about 45 minutes and I pulled out of there with 18 fish before I moved down the shoreline. And I'm way ahead of my expectations for the day. I've got half of what I caught last trip and I've got no visibility at all. But I'm thinking about this and it started to make sense because I know when I launched the boat before I parked my truck, I noticed that the water was really clear against the edge, but like I said, just a little ways out. Once the depth got past that 2 foot mark, 20 inches, 24 inches, you could not see bottom at all. But it was very clear right in that real shallow stuff because of the depth of the water. So I'm thinking possibly throwing that shallow into those two depressions, it's the water's so skinny, it's clearer there. And I think that's why those fish were grouped up there. They're never in those two little pockets. Maybe you'll get one if you fish them both, but I pulled, 15 out of those or 14 out of there after catching 4 around that dock. It just amazed me that there were that many fish stacked there. So I keep going up the shoreline and I came to another area. Any place that had grass, I took a spinnerbait rod there because I caught them good last time and I thought I'd like to catch them on a spinnerbait because I really like doing that. And smallmouth will chase. But when I saw the water clarity and knew it was full blown turnover, I didn't think it would work. But I did try it. I tried it every place I had a shallow grassy flat and it produced casting practice. I didn't have a single strike. So I kind of put that rod down, and what I found was that Ned rig, that was the deal. I was using a green pumpkin Z-Man 3-inch TRD grub on a 1/5 Z-Man Ned head, a Shrooms Ned head, 1/5 ounce, and it's got a super sharp hook. It's got a great retainer for your plastic so they don't get pulled off. And if you've used the Z-Man plastics, you know how durable they are. And incredible. Catch a ton of fish on them. I got to the next spot where, I'm going up the shoreline and there's a lot of shallow water, but it was not producing. It's a 3-foot flat and it's a mud flat. There's really nothing there to hold fish. And I threw, dirt shallow in that real skinny water that was clear, but I wasn't pulling anything. Typically, if I stay out off that bank, there's a vertical drop and it levels out at about 9-10 foot. And I had done really well there with a drop shot last time I fished it. And I tried that and I got zero response, which made sense because with the turnover, the visibility is 20 inches. That's what I found. And I just could not get bit on that drop shot rig. So I went back to the bank and I came along another area where there's a small cottage type camp and they've got a big stone retaining wall that they have all wired together so it doesn't fall apart over the years with the lake freezing and thawing and ice moving everything. And they've done a good job. It's always stayed nice and square. And that's a good spot for 1 or 2 fish. But on this day, throwing that Ned rig, I picked up another 10 or 12 fish there. It was crazy. I was getting hit on every single cast. Now, some of these fish would pull off halfway in. Some of them I'd miss on the hook set. A lot of them I landed. I think with the water clarity so diminished, they were either having trouble finding it or getting it correctly. I don't think it was anything I'm doing. Some of the fish were hooked really good. Only 2 of them really choked it. Most of them were hooked pretty good, but then when I lost them on the jump or if I missed them on the hook set, I just assumed that they were not getting it very well because of the water clarity. And I had nothing else to base it on other than the ones I did land were all hooked reasonably well. Some of them were barely hooked, a small percentage. And that I try to analyze everything I can from every fish that bites. They'll all teach you something if only you pay attention and try to listen to the fish. So I had two spots that had been particularly good. And as I moved up that shoreline, I had quite about a mile of shoreline before you come into a corner and go across it'd be the west end of the lake. And as I'm continuing up this shoreline, there's a place that's generally real good. There's a rock ledge that's generally really, really good. And I couldn't buy a strike there, but just past that rock ledge, there's two docks and there's a grassy bank with bushes on it, but it's a sheer drop. I mean, it drops deep fast. It's a couple feet deep for a very short distance, and then there's just a vertical drop, and it drops right down to 10, 12 feet.
Perfect.
Great area for a drop shot.
Yeah.
Yeah, great area for a drop shot if you got clear water. But with the water in full-blown turnover, I was trying to cast as close as I could to that bank and risking getting snagged, which I did a couple times. But if I hit right where the water touched the bank, again, that whole length of that grass and bush bank, I can't remember how many fish I caught there. It was again, it was the third area where it was like every single cast I was getting smacked by a fish. And some of these were way better than average smallmouth for that lake. And God grief, they were aggressive. They hit it hard, which told me I think there's a lot of fish there. But something really cool that occurred, I had not been anchoring or anything because it was basically a calm day. Once the breeze did come up, it was, I mean, just pushing me on the perfect inching along drift up towards that west end. But as I neared that west end, the wind shifted and picked up and started me pushing back into water I had already covered. As I'm landing yet another smallmouth from that shallow water right on the edge of that drop, the wind pushed me back and pushed the boat. I was almost against that first dock. Once I released the fish, I reached out with my hand and pushed my boat off the dock so it didn't hit it. And I just said, and this is cool, this never happened. I said, I wonder. And I thought it was deeper at this dock. I peeled a bunch of line off. I said, I'm just going to see if there's a largemouth under this dock. And I dropped that Ned rig vertically, and it was only 4.5 feet off that dock. I thought it was deeper. I can't tell because the water's olive green. So I peeled off about 5.5 foot of line, and I call this doodling. There was about a foot between the edge of my boat and the end of this dock. And I just took the rod and lowered it down until I had a little slack in that line. And when I went to lift it, my rod loaded up and I flip a smallmouth in the boat on 5.5 foot of line on a Ned rig. I'm like, that was cool. I unhook him again, stand up, lower 4.5 foot of line down till I get a little slack in my line, go to lift it up. My rod loads a second time. Second drop, first lift, I pull in a largemouth. Holy cow. What was he doing with a smallmouth there? I drop it down a third time and instantly load up and pull out a second smallmouth. 3 fish off the end of the dock in 3 drops, 4.5 foot of water in that olive green water. But now the breeze has pushed me off that dock quite a bit. So I just take that Ned rig and I flip a short cast up there parallel and drag it past the end of the dock, get a strike, and pull in a 4th fish off that dock, another smallmouth. I kept trying to fish it, but there were no more bites. But I just picked 4 fish off that dock in 4 drops in full-blown turnover. That to me was just incredibly cool. Never happens. And I went back up past that, took the trolling motor and just went up past that dock and got back on that grass bank with the bushes, picked a few more fish off it until they stopped biting entirely. And at that point I said, man, I've spent a lot of time in this area, but good grief, I had like 38 bass at that point, and I had a bunch of perch, I go across the west end of the lake. Now, the west end of the lake, the right-hand side of that end, the right half of that end has a lot of property, and they have a long stone wall as a retaining wall, hand-built stone wall. And then beyond their camp, the other properties, there's boulders and rocks against the bank. There's a couple docks. There's just naturally occurring rock. One other guy has a stone wall. There's a bank with pine trees. And then there's just like an open hayfield and just a muddy flat. And typically, we'll catch a lot of bass from the right-hand corner halfway across to where we run out of the rock along the bank. And it turns to that hayfield where it just goes to reeds and a mud bottom. But on that first half, there's usually a lot of smallmouth. And knowing how the day was going, I decided to come into that stone wall. I pulled my boat off the bank within a cast length, and I anchored down and said, I just don't want to, the wind was blowing harder now. I don't want to drift all over the place. I want to anchor down and saturate an area and then move up, anchor down, saturate an area. That way I can cover everything, and I've got time to do it. I had 38 bass when I started fishing that stone wall. Now, I threw the Ned rig and I threw it right where that water comes against the stone wall, and that shallow stuff where there was some clear water, and I could not get a strike. But about 20 to 25 feet out from that wall, I get a strike. Surprised me. That hadn't happened all day. I swing, load up, and I've got one of my best smallmouth of the day. I'm figuring he was a loner. I land that fish, fire again to the stone wall, expecting a strike as soon as it hit that little bit of clear water that's really, really shallow. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. And I'm working it back. I hit that 20, 25 foot range, and bam, I get a hard strike, and I hook up, and a smallmouth jumps and throws it. I'm like, what are they doing 25 feet off this shore where that water's dirty? But in this particular area, that happened again and again and again. I was on that first anchor spot again for almost an hour, JD, and I honestly can't remember making a cast where I didn't have some kind of contact, either a fish that picked it up and dropped it, or a fish that hit it a couple times and I missed him, or a fish that just smacked it and I hooked up and I landed him, or a fish that jumped off. I literally cannot remember making a cast in an hour where I didn't have a contact. I don't think I did. I honestly don't think I did. It was that busy.
Humble brag.
Well, no, that's not where I'm going with that.
I know. I'm just messing with you.
This doesn't happen in turnover. This was full-blown turnover. I have never had a day like that, and it's blowing my mind that I'm having this kind of success with these fish in these conditions. I've been writing this stuff down for 40 years. Turnover is the kiss of death, and I'm having a day like no other. I promise you, that entry got written in red ink because that was a red letter day. In my journal, I've explained my color coding system, and that earned the red ink when I broke 50 fish. Like I said, I had 38 when I started fishing and anchored down on that first section of that stone wall. And I broke 50 sitting in that one spot and just kept catching them and catching them and catching them. It was unbelievable. I was worried about doing a podcast on this because I'm thinking nobody's going to believe this. Because if anybody listening to this has had a day like that during full-blown turnover, I want to hear about it because we need to compare notes. Let's figure this out. I learned a lot that day. I know it can help other people. And if somebody else has unlocked it, I want to know what you did. Let's figure this out together and write the book on how to deal with turnover, because it's like the worst 2 weeks of the entire year in the fall. I just extracted everything I could from this first area. And when that bite finally got to the point where, okay, now I'm not making contact on a cast. I'm not getting bit on a cast. Nothing's happening. I must have worn this area out. I finally pull up and I move up to the next section and I drop anchor again. I start firing casts out, throwing them dirt shallow, but fully expecting to get bit at that 25-foot range. And I'm picking up nothing. I think on that second anchor spot, I maybe fished there 15 minutes and I think I picked up 2. And I think those were the only 2 strikes I got. And I knew I'd worn out the first spot I just left. So I moved up a little bit farther. I said, I'm going to skip the anchor. I'm just going to keep my foot on the trolling motor and let's cover this area. The wind had actually died off. I had a lot of good cloud cover now, which I didn't have earlier. It was a high pressure system. That was the other thing. High pressure system, not conducive to a strong bite, but they didn't seem to care. I get to the third spot and I think I picked up 1 fish. That was it. I get to a fourth spot, which now I'm pretty much at the end of all the good water, and I didn't pick up anything. But at that point, I had 74 fish under full blown turnover conditions. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And I had covered all my best water. However, going down the south side of the lake, which has about a mile of shoreline, there are some good areas. I had maybe an hour left, so I just stayed on the trolling motor and I'm casting. I'm only hitting the sweet spots and I'm picking up absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. I had like 4 key areas that always produce a few, but they were barren. So I saved the last 15 minutes to go back to the first camp at that stone wall where I figured out what to do for the day. And I fished the entire thing in that last 15 minutes and never got a single strike. I said, hey, it's a good thing I started when I did because I figured out what to do for the day. And to go out in full blown turnover conditions and catch 74 fish when I expected to get 3 or 4 if I could grind them out. Just it blew my mind. And there were 4 key areas where I caught those fish. And almost every single fish came out of those 4 key areas. Now the similarities are the first 3 areas you had to throw, I mean, so shallow, I couldn't believe that their fins were not sticking out of the water. Their fins on their back weren't sticking above the surface. Maybe they were. I wasn't looking for that. They were so shallow in those first 3 areas, and that's what I had to do to catch them. But that 4th area was totally different. Same criteria, stone wall, with that shallow water against it. What had produced in the other 3 key areas, every fish bit 20 to 25 feet out from that wall. And it was so consistent that I could call my shot. I would cast to that stone wall. I'd work the bait back, not getting a strike. When I get about 20 feet out, I'd say out loud, there should be one right about there. Bam! I'd get a strike. Just like that. I mean, you could call your shot. It was unreal. And it was so consistent the entire time I fished until the bite just kind of fizzled out and then nothing bit, including an area that was hot to begin with. So here's what I think I learned from that. And I think it's a good takeaway. Next time you guys go out, you go fishing in full blown turnover, use a slow moving bait, something that's going to make contact with the bottom where the fish are, where they can relate to things that they can see, and do not be afraid to throw super, super shallow. And that's what worked for me. And hey, please go out and try to prove me wrong. And hopefully it'll prove me right. And you'll unlock a key to how to catch fish consistently in a full blown turnover. I'm going back tomorrow. I'm going to the river because I got a pre-fish for a tournament, and I don't know what conditions the river are in right now. So I mean, if I run into that, I'm going to be doing that to start. and see if I can duplicate. But if you got turnover in your area right now, please go out and try that and let me know how you do. And again, if you've had a crazy, crazy good day during turnover with something that you've done, please let us know about it. And we'll put the information out there and share it with the listeners too, because together we can figure this out and conquer the dreaded turnover drought that occurs for 2 weeks every year in the fall everywhere we all live. And I mean, just more information. Help us tap into our angler within. Okay.
Hey, there you go.
That would be awesome. I'd appreciate it. And I'd promise you I'll share it with everybody else. Turnover has always been the bane of fishing in the fall. It's the kiss of death, and it's unavoidable. It's going to happen. Man, it's a good time to paint the siding or rake the leaves or anything like that, but I would rather fish and figure it out, So
I got out today
that's
and I threw everything that you said not to throw. And then right when I was starting to get into the jigs, I ran out of time. I got out of there.
we haven't talked about this. How was the bite on the baits I said not to throw?
Non-existent.
Non-existent. And
Non-existent.
you had turnover where you were, right?
High turnover. It's awful.
Yeah.
It's awful in the West Branch, and it's awful where I am. I'll say where I'm at. I'm on the Susquehanna. It's not good right now.
It's that time of year. Yep.
There was nothing, but I tell you what, though, Roy Bilby, I am quite the crack shot with a bait caster.
It's working out for you.
It is working out. I'm accurate. with that thing. It's the learning curve is still there, but man, am I getting more confidence with it. So for all you out there
that's the same outfit that Mason bought at Bass Pro Shops, and I was so impressed with his ability with it. That's why I recommended that one. I'm super impressed. 8 ball bearings, and I thought that might be a little too polished, but you've been knocking it out of the park. So it was a great one to start with. So Mason, if you're listening, thanks for cueing me into that deal. That was a great deal for JD, and it's working the same way for him.
Right on. Well, speaking of working, work your way into Roy's DMs over at his Instagram at all lowercase Roy Bilby. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, if you're in the market for a bait caster, and we've talked about this before, I have explained how to get over the hurdle with a bait caster. We have discovered that there's it's a lose. What's it called? The mock
It's a
smash.
Yep.
Combo. It's a
all
lose.
red.
All red. A 7-foot lose medium action rod. Got 10 guides. They're good guides. It's got a lose 8 ball bearing bait cast reel on it. It's $150 at Bass Pro Shops. I'll tell you what, I'm super impressed with the way it casts. 2 guys I know that I fished with have bought this as their first bait caster and have done phenomenally well with it. Just something about that combo. If you're in the market, I want to try a bait caster, I highly recommend that one. Get out to Bass Pro Shops and buy the Ruse. The rod is completely red. It's got the Win grips on it. It's a tremendous deal for $150. You will not be disappointed. It's a great reel, a great medium action rod. It's got great action, and it casts a mile, and these guys are not blowing up the reels. So I can't overstress how important it is to have, when you're starting out, to have a good enough combo that makes it easier to cast. And apparently that one does. So I highly recommend it.
Am I one of those 2 people?
Yeah, you're one of the 2 people.
Okay,
you
good.
And Mason.
All right. Yes. All right. Just making sure.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what. I hope these tips on how to conquer the dreaded fall turnover have inspired you to go out and try it. I cannot believe the day I had. I'm anxious to get out and duplicate before the turnover is over. And if that lake is clear, I'm going to be looking for one with turnover so I can prove it to myself again, because I've never had a day like that, and I'm certain I can duplicate. And we appreciate you guys listening and supporting us, and we will always try to help you tap into your angler within.